Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, is the Senate in a quorum call?
The Senate is not in a quorum call.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to talk about some of the important issues that we're debating here on the Senate floor, and actually they're quite important, and we're having a good debate. And I want to just talk about some of the votes that we've taken in the last couple days. We voted on what I think was termed, really focused on the Senate's border bill. A lot of people worked hard on that. I know the presiding officer did, Senator Langford. I did not vote to proceed to consider that bill. There's a whole host of reasons. I think the most important from my perspective was this administration, the Biden administration, came in, said we're going to have a policy of full open borders, which they have. There's no doubt about that. Every American knows it, sees it. It impacts people in Alaska negatively. Over 300,000 illegal immigrants in December, all-time record, on track for 10 million. My view, the border bill did not go far enough, and it's hard to trust the administration even on provisions that we would want them to enforce, given their disastrous record for the last 3 years. So I was a no on that. And then we turned to the national security supplemental. And Mr. President, I want to talk a lot about that this afternoon because it's very important. And I voted actually to proceed to the debate, to start debating, hopefully amending this important bill. Now, it's being called many things. Some are calling it the Ukraine bill, Ukraine aid bill, some Israel bill. Having read it, having worked hard over the last 4 to 5 months to actually shape it, I think it should have a different name. Maybe this name, the Fighting Authoritarian Aggression National Security Bill. But, Mr. President, probably the best title for this piece of legislation that we are now debating should be the National Security Industrial Base Renaissance Bill. So I hope my colleagues take a look at it, hope they read it, but I'm going to explain why I think it should be called that, and then we're obviously going to have a good debate on this bill. And I'm hoping that this bill, and I've mentioned this to my Republican colleagues in particular, when people look at it and we debate it and try to make it better here on the floor, that it will unify the Republican conference. And at the end, hopefully get more support because I think this is an important reason. There are a lot of reasons why, Mr. President, I think this can unify members of the Senate, members of the Republican conference. First, let me just go into one of the most obvious, which I think almost everybody agrees with. If you don't, maybe you're not reading the news. But we are in a real dangerous period, Mr. President, led by this guy, this new era of authoritarian aggression, as I call it, where you have dictatorships on the march, very aggressive. That's Xi Jinping, the dictator of China. They're going through the biggest peacetime buildup in world history of their military. Biggest peacetime buildup ever, of any country, ever. I keep close tabs on what the Chinese are doing. This guy likes to dress up in fatigues. He is an aggressive authoritarian dictator, working very closely with Putin, working very closely with the Ayatollahs, the terrorists in Tehran, working very closely with Kim Jong-un, the dictator in North Korea. These dictatorships are all working together. I won't go into all of it, but if you go to armed services hearings, intel hearings, they're working closely together. And they're willing to use military force, particularly against their democratic neighbors, either directly or through proxies like Hamas when they invaded Israel, to try to undermine American interests and those of our allies. That is happening. We are in one of the most dangerous periods since World War II right now. So that's one reason that a bill like this should unify us. Another, Mr. President, is our industrial base in the United States has dramatically withered, particularly in its ability to protect us. What do I mean by protect us? To produce weapon systems, to produce ammunition. Again, this is a fact. If you don't believe that, well, maybe you should do a little more research. Our industrial base is withering. It is a shadow of its former self during the Cold War, certainly during previous wars. And, Mr. President, let me just give you an example. You know a lot about submarines. We're supposed to be building 1.2 Virginia-class subs a year. That's our goal. We can barely build one a year. This is making our sub fleet, which is one of our greatest asymmetric advantages over this guy, shrink. Even worse, Mr. President, 37% of our attack submarine fleet, that's about 18 subs, are in maintenance or idle or awaiting maintenance, just sitting there, because we don't have the industrial capacity to maintain our submarine base. Anyone who studies this knows this is a giant, giant problem. And Mr. President, we all know this. If the bullets start flying, if a dictator like this launches a war against one of our allies, or Putin does, or Iran does, they're trying to sink U.S. ships in the Red Sea right now anyways, literally troops under attack. When the bullets are flying, that's not the time you need to build up your industrial base. So if we're in a real dangerous period, which we are, and the American ability in terms of our industrial base to protect our own country has withered, which it has, that's another reason we should be thinking, let's do something about it. Mr. President, a third reason that people on my side of the aisle should be taking this legislation seriously is that it's an opportunity to make up for what has been an incredibly weak Biden administration approach to national security. Now, Mr. President, I talk about this a lot, but this administration is not serious about national security. The President has put forward 3 times in his budget each year the Department of Defense cuts, inflation-adjusted cuts. He'll crank up the EPA and Department of Interior 20, 25, 30%. DOD, every year, Joe Biden cuts it. The current budget shrinks the Army, shrinks the Navy, shrinks the Marine Corps. You think he's impressed by that? He's not. Next year's budget, the Biden budget, will bring the United States below 3% of GDP on military spending. It's probably, Mr. President, the 4th or 5th time we've been below 3% in 80 years. You think he's impressed with that? He's not. And we have an administration led by civilians at the Pentagon who are not focused on lethality, who are not focused on war fighting, have been distracted by some of these far-left social issues, which in my view have no business being in the Pentagon with our war fighters. So this bill that we're debating right now is a chance to start a course correction in the dangerous world we're facing because of dictators like this, and the very weak response of the Biden administration's approach to national security and defense, which they have always, go look at the budgets, always prioritized dead last of any federal agency. So, what does it do? Well, let's take a look. This is from an article from the Washington Post based on a study by the American Enterprise Institute on what this supplemental, this is actually where it was in November, what this does. And I think, Mr. President, the most important point that I want to emphasize here is that this bill is primarily focused on rebuilding our military industrial base in this new era of authoritarian aggression. That is the principal focus. Over half of the dollars that are in this bill over half, over $50 billion, go directly to America's capacity, our capacity, in states all across this great nation, mostly in the Midwest and on the East Coast, some out in California, to build weapons, to build ammo, and to be ready for war if it comes. Over $50 billion. There will be thousands and thousands of jobs created by these direct investments in America. Mr. President, this is a generational investment in our ability to defend ourselves. What do you mean? What do I mean by generational? Some of these investments we will see 15 or 20 years from now, hopefully still producing weapons, submarines. So let me just give you a few examples. Let's start with submarines. Our greatest comparative advantage relative to China. They're catching up in a whole host of areas, but not in terms of subs. This has $3 billion to go directly into the American submarine industrial capacity, which will unlock another $3 billion from our AUKUS agreement with Australia. That is $6 billion to our industrial base for submarines. $5 billion for 155 artillery shells. Over $500 million for counter-UAS systems. The other weapon systems this directly invests in America: Patriots, Gimlers, Javelins, Harpoons, Tomahawks, HARMs, tow missiles, built by Americans for our defense. You get the picture, Mr. President. Over $50 billion of this bill will be directly into our industrial base to defend ourselves. Working class Americans, America's national security will benefit. This is replenishing our weapon stocks, our ammunition stocks for the U.S. military, and yes, for our allies to purchase, some of whom are at war today. Ukraine, of course, and Israel. Now, Mr. President, there's been a lot of focus on Ukraine and a lot of arguments about whether to provide continued lethal aid. I strongly support that. But, Mr. President, this bill also focuses on other allies, which, like I said, in the Republican conference, I believe unifies us. Ukraine has been a debate, but let me start with Israel. Mr. President, I've been out to Israel twice in the last year, including about 10 days after the October 7th attacks with a bipartisan group of senators. It's obviously our most important ally in the Middle East, one of our most important allies in the world. Here's what I think a lot of people miss. Right now, if you go there, you'll see it, you'll feel it, you'll understand it. Israel is under an existential threat to the very existence of their state and their people, as clear as day. Iran, all the proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. This is not an exaggeration. This defense bill has close to $17 billion for Israel and U.S. forces in U.S. Central Command that right now are being attacked. Right now. Iron Dome, David Sling, interceptors, about $2.5 billion for CENTCOM operations for our U.S. forces who are literally taking missiles from the Houthis right now on Navy ships in the Red Sea. I think everybody agrees you got to fund our troops. Let me give you another area that I think unifies us, Mr. President. Should unify all senators. I think it unifies a lot of Republicans. And that's Taiwan and Indo-PACOM. Mr. President, Taiwan has been a big focus of mine throughout my career. I just retired from the U.S. Marine Corps last week, actually, as a colonel after 30 years of service. My first deployment as a U.S. Marine was to the Taiwan Strait in 1995 and 96. 2 carrier strike groups and a Marine amphibious ready group that I was a young infantry officer on. We were there as a U.S. commitment when the PLA was threatening to invade Taiwan. That's called the Third Taiwan Strait Crisis. It was their first presidential election. American commitment was there. I finished out my Marine Corps time as the Chief of Staff at Marine Forces Pacific Command, which is a whole focus on Taiwan. The first time I ever visited Taiwan, Mr. President, as a U.S. Senator, I'll never forget, a number of senators were there. We got on the bus. The head of our AIT embassy, essentially, it's not really an embassy, unofficial embassy, he welcomed us, an American citizen. So welcome to Taiwan, one of the most dynamic economies, one of the most vibrant democracies on the planet, and the only reason it exists today is because of the commitment of the U.S. military and America. 8 decades we've kept Taiwan free. Mr. President, the initial supplemental that came up to the Senate didn't have a lot for Taiwan or Indo-PACOM. A number of us knew why. President Biden was getting ready to meet with Xi Jinping. They didn't want to ruin the mood music of that meeting, so they didn't put much in to defend Taiwan, help us defend Taiwan as the Taiwan Relations Act requires. So a number of us worked together, Senator Collins in particular, in my office. This bill has about $16.4 billion for Indo-PACOM relevant munitions, security assistance, capacity expansion to deter China in the Taiwan Strait and throughout the Indo-PACOM theater. I'd like to submit the list, Mr. President, for the record.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, these are areas that I think can unify us. Industrial base, workers, Taiwan, Israel. Like any bill, there are things in here I don't like, Mr. President. Too much direct support to Ukraine, direct budget support. I think the European Union, Europeans should be doing that, not us. Senator Collins did a good job of limiting that. It still has too much. If we have an amendment process here, I have an amendment that would strip that, focus on lethal aid, not budget support, where the Europeans can do that. There's other amendments out here to enhance what we give our allies. President Biden's team recently said we're not going to send any more LNG to Asia or Europe. I just spoke with a very senior European elected official who thinks that's a real bad idea. We have an amendment that said you can't do that, Mr. President. We got to send energy to our allies. So there's a lot more we can do to improve this bill. But, Mr. President, I'll end with this. You know, one of the arguments against this bill is say, well, you know what? We don't have to do anything in Ukraine. We'll let Putin roll. But we'll be real strong in Taiwan. We'll be real strong all over the rest of the world. We'll deter these authoritarians there. Don't worry so much about Ukraine. But, Mr. President, as you know, that's not really how the world works. It's not how the world works. Deterrence is not divisible. American credibility is not divisible. You can't say we're going to be real strong in the Taiwan Strait, but, you know, no problem in Ukraine or with Israel. These authoritarians are working together, and we need a strategic response to this very dangerous period. And how do we know deterrence is not divisible? I think the Biden administration demonstrated it with their botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. When that happened, a number of us, myself included, said, watch, watch. The authoritarian regimes around the world are going to test. They're going to probe. They're going to go into different areas and press. And of course, that happened. I don't think you have the Ukraine invasion by Russia without the botched Afghanistan withdrawal. But again, Mr. President, what I'm trying to do here with my colleagues, Democrat and Republicans, is say it's not a perfect bill. I want to amend it. I certainly hope we can get to an amendment process. I know a lot of people want to get to that. But there's a lot in this bill, more than half dedicated to American industrial base, billions dedicated to Taiwan, billions dedicated to Israel, that I think should unite us. And I'm hopeful that's going to happen. I yield the floor.